Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Like most of the press corps, the BBC is fully vested in promoting the superstition that bad weather is caused by the use of low-cost, reliable energy. And anyone who doesn't support their superstition is labeled a climate denier. This is a thinly veiled attempt to associate people who tell the truth about climate with neo-Nazis who reject the Holocaust. The BBC refuses to talk to anyone who doesn't support their superstitions about energy. But their climate disinformation reporters wrote this article, Climate Change: How to Talk to a Denier. The BBC has a lot of staff reporting climate disinformation, but these two disinformers have it written right into their job description. The article is full of the usual drivel and propaganda attempting to associate low-cost, reliable energy with bad weather. But I found this section particularly interesting. They throw out the idea that there's a widespread belief that people who reject their superstitions about energy are stupid or uneducated. And they discuss one particular climate denier named Brian. They say he grew up in rural Minnesota in the 1970s. It was incredibly cold, and this made it hard for him to believe scientists who spoke of a warming planet. But that isn't what scientists were talking about in the 1970s. They were talking about a cooling planet. In 1961, the New York Times reported a unanimous consensus among scientists that the world was getting colder. On January 11, 1970, the Washington Post ran this story: Colder winters held dawn of new ice age. In 1971, the Washington Post quoted NASA's leading climate scientist as saying the world could be as little as 50 or 60 years away from a disastrous new ice age. That would be between the years 2021 and 2031. In 1970, the New York Times reported U.S. and Soviet press studies of a colder Arctic. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. And in order to stop the cooling, scientists wanted to sprinkle black coal dust on the Arctic ice in order to melt it. In 1972, 42 top American and European investigators met at Brown University to discuss global cooling. They sent a letter to President Nixon warning of a new ice age in about a century. In 1974, the National Center for Atmospheric Research published this graph showing a tremendous amount of cooling through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And they showed 1970 as being cooler than 1870. Scientists at the time blamed droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes on this global cooling. Exactly the same things they now blame on global warming. The cover of Science News on March 1, 1975 was titled "The Ice Age Cometh," and they showed glaciers plowing through downtown Manhattan. So going back to the BBC article, it was very cold in Minnesota during the 1970s, but scientists were talking about a cooling planet, not a warming planet. Energy realist Brian is correct that the 1970s were very cold. The coldest three-year period for winters in the United States were 1977, 1978, and 1979. 1978 was the coldest winter in the United States. Winter temperatures in the United States plummeted from the 1950s into the 1970s. So it's no surprise that academics and the press were pushing the idea of global cooling and a new ice age. But 1 century earlier in 1878 was probably the warmest winter on record in the United States. The Minneapolis Tribune reported that there was no winter at all in Minnesota that year. 1878 was the peak year of the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, an ocean circulation pattern. A century later, in 1978, the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation was very low, and that was the coldest winter on record in the United States. So this was the warmest, and this was the coldest. What controls temperatures in many locations around the Atlantic Ocean is the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. The 1878 peak of the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation also coincided with a very large El Nino. This led to a terrible heat wave and drought which killed 10 million people in India and 20 million people in China. Before the Australian Bureau of Meteorology erased all of their data before 1910, they showed the hottest temperature in New South Wales as having occurred on January 17, 1877. It was 52.8 degrees Celsius at Burke. But that's not convenient politically, so the Bureau of Meteorology now hides all of the high temperatures before 1910. In the year 2000, NASA showed 1878 as being the warmest year prior to 1980. And they showed no warming from the 1870s through the 1970s. But now NASA hides all the data before 1880 and shows a strong warming trend which didn't exist in their 2000 version of the data. However, I don't think NASA tampering with their own data is going to bring back to life the 30 million people who died in the heat wave and drought in 1878. Unlike NASA climate scientists and the BBC, these people in 1878 had to deal with reality. Energy alarmists don't have any interest in communicating. What they rely on is censorship. After 10 years on Twitter, Twitter suspended my account for telling the truth. They said that violated the Twitter rules. The world's #1 climate fraudster, Michael Mann, has tweeted with glee about me being silenced on Twitter. I've tried to get him and just about every other well-known climate alarmist to debate me in a live debate. None of them will do that because they know that if they do, I will make them appear very incompetent and dishonest. So they hide from reality behind censorship. Lots of hit pieces against me have been done by the press. This is one of my favorites. In their fact check, Snopes first confirmed everything I was saying and then concluded that made me wrong. I showed how NASA had tampered with their U.S. temperature data to turn a long-term cooling trend into a warming trend. Snopes didn't disagree with what I was showing, but they said the scientists did it because they had to. And like every other hit piece which has been written about me, Snopes made no attempt to contact me. 5 years ago, I testified before the Washington State Senate Environment Committee. The bulk of my presentation was historical data and newspaper archives from the New York Times. The Seattle Press didn't talk to me. They didn't report on anything I said. All that they reported was, "Climate change denier testifies for 40 minutes before State Senate Environment Committee." And then they went on to blame my testimony, which they wouldn't discuss, on President Trump. The New York Times followed up with another hit piece about that testimony without talking to me or even understanding what my testimony was about. They should have been flattered by all the New York Times articles I used in my 40-minute testimony. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, "We know they're lying. They know they're lying. They know that we know they're lying, yet they continue to lie." The BBC publishes this sort of propaganda targeting low-cost, reliable energy and then says they're the most trusted news source in the world. I don't know anyone who trusts the BBC, but if they do have trust, it's trust like Bernie Madoff had. Toto's been pulling back the curtain on these superstitions targeting low-cost, reliable energy for the past 14 years. You can visit Toto, Kyrie Caesar, Toki, and Upala on the web at realclimatescience.com.